Today's video is going to completely change how you play Back 4 Blood and how you build decks in Back 4 Blood. And I'm so excited to talk about it. There's going to be a ton of information in this video, so hold on to your butt cheeks. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to showcase these things by using Knowledge is Power. And what this card does is it allows us to see the values of damage that we do to enemies, and we get to see their health bars as well, at least on Special Ridden. So let's get straight into it here because it's so interesting. Something to note right away is I am on Nightmare mode. Nightmare and Veteran have a different damage value than Recruit does. Recruit gives you 50% more damage. It doesn't give you any more bonus damage, which we'll talk about, but it gives you 50% more damage. Okay? Now we're going to test things on Nightmare because I think that's what people are most interested in, and don't think it matters what gun you use, because I tested the percentage values, and what I found was that things were the same based off of if I use an M4 versus if I use an M1, meaning that classes of guns don't provide different weak spot damage values from a percentage basis. Now this gun hits harder than this gun does, so the number is going to be bigger, but percentage wise it appeared to be the same. Okay, now this is where things really get interesting right away. So what I can do here is I can shoot this guy, and what you'll see is I do 38 damage. Now that'll be the same thing if you look in the firing range, but the firing range doesn't showcase anything in terms of bonus damage. And this is where things get really, really cool. So I'm going to try to shoot one of these guys here and take a look. Instead of seeing 38, what you see is 2 numbers. That's a big deal. That is one of the biggest deals about this game, is that there's 2 numbers instead of 1. They are separate numbers that do separate things and aren't related at all. So the 38 is the gun damage that we did with this M1. The 41.8 is the bonus damage from the weak spot. Okay? Now, to be clear, this is going to be different versus regular Ridden versus mutations or special Ridden. So what happens with a regular Ridden is that it takes the base value of your weapon and just does it again in its own separate category, which is bonus weak spot damage. So reason why the numbers were different is because I have this card here that increases weak spot damage by 10%. But if you didn't have that there, what you would have saw is a 38 and then a 38. One of which was gun damage, one of which was the bonus damage you did because you hit a weak spot. I need to make it clear that this is the way this works because this will change a little bit when we talk about mutations. So you do your gun damage and then you do your bonus weak spot damage. The reason why this matters so much is your cards do not behave the way you think they do, because you can upgrade your damage, but you are not necessarily increasing that weak spot number. If I add Glass Cannon into my deck, that 41.8 will not go up. However, if I do weak spot cards like Hyper Focus, the 41.8 will go up, but the 38 won't. So certain cards do certain things, and you really need to understand how they all work because it gets really messy. Now, the same thing here happens with melee attacks. So if you take a peek here, I can go ahead and hit this guy, and I hit him for 1 chunk of damage, which was 15. But if I hit him in the head, I get that bonus weak spot damage. Okay? Now, let's start getting into the meat and potatoes of why this is so confusing. I'm going to start picking different cards, and you'll see how things change. Now, to showcase one of the first big, like, what is going on here moments that I had when I was testing this, let's go ahead and put on Glass Cannon. Now, remember, the numbers before were 38 when you hit a Ridden, and then 41.8 when you hit that extra bonus damage on their head, okay? So let's go ahead and hit him again. So we have 25% extra damage, so that should be 25% higher than 38. And sure enough, it is. If you go ahead and you take 38 and you multiply that by 1.25, you're going to get 47.5. But now take a look at this real closely here. If you take a look at Glass Cannon, it says plus 25% damage. So you would assume that that's kind of a blanket statement and it will do plus 25% damage everywhere. It doesn't. It's a big difference here. It does not affect a certain part of this game that you would expect. So now, let's hit him in the head. What you'll see is 47.5, but we still only have that 41.8. Why did that not go up? That is because it is its own separate category that is unaffected, apparently, by damage. It is weak spot damage, and the only thing that will affect that is, actually, you know what? Let's talk about that. That gets complicated too. But Glass Cannon does not seem to care about adding to that bonus weak spot damage. I want to make that 41.8 higher. How am I going to do that? Well, really obvious way to do that is to pick a weak spot damage card. So we have hyper focused on, and let's see how much we do. So again, if we hit him in the tummy, what we're going to do is 38 damage. That is unchanged. But now let's hit him in the head, and what we'll do, and suddenly you see there's a 60.8 next to that other number. So that 41.8 climbed all the way to a 60.8. So we got a big chunk of damage out of that. A regular Ridden has like, I don't know, 20 health. It changes a lot with all these different modifiers you can get, but a regular Ridden has about 20 health. Think of weak spot kind of living in its own little world that has nothing to do with regular gun damage. This whole topic's going to change when we hit mutations, but again, think of it for now as its own little thing that has nothing to do with anything else. This is purely just, congrats, you did it, you hit him in the head type of a thing. Now this is where you're going to have to start paying close attention. So the card we have equipped now is Silver Bullets, and what this does is it increases your bullet damage by 10%. Okay, so when I shoot a gun, that means it's 10% more effective, right? So it just says bullet damage. It doesn't say weak spot damage, so let's go ahead and take a look. If we go ahead and we hit them, we should see something a little bit higher than 38, something 10% higher than 38, right? And sure enough, 41.8. That is because that's 10% higher than 38. Makes sense. Now here's, again, where you got to hold on to your butts. Now, if you pick Glass Cannon, that doesn't increase your weak spot damage. So naturally, you would think that, oh, if it's not a weak spot damage card, it's not going to increase weak spot damage. But for some reason, if you take a peek here, what you'll see is we have a 46 in there now. That bonus number that we just got is a 46. The bonus number before was a 41.8. So what's happening is that for some reason, bullet damage not only increases your regular gun damage, but it also increases your weak spot damage, which is going to get really important on mutations. But this is increasing that bonus thing that kind of lives in its own little world for some reason. Don't know why. I guess bullet damage is just special. So this is a little misleading, because if you see plus 25 damage on Glass Cannon, you're like, okay, plus 25 damage probably across the board. No, it's only on the weapon damage. Where with this, it says plus 10% bullet damage, but really what it's doing is plus 10% weapon damage and then also plus 10% weak spot damage. This card looks way more interesting when you see two things being affected, doesn't it? But they didn't list it that way. And something to keep in mind here is these things compound with each other based off of the categories that they are in. Now, this is a really big part of this, so pay close attention. Now, if you go ahead and you take 38, you know, I'm going to get my calculator. Okay, calculator's here, and now we're going to talk about categories because this is a very big part of this game. So we're going to talk about why that's a 46 and not anything else in the world, right? So let's take a look here one more time, and we're going to hit a 41.8 and a 46. The 41.8 is our weapon damage, and then the 46 is our bonus damage, right? So why is that a 46? So let's take a look at this. Now, remember what I told you, how when you hit a regular Ridden in the head, it does your gun damage, whatever the gun's going to do, and that it also does bonus damage that is equal to that gun damage, but it's in its own weak spot category, okay? So that means our base is 38, okay? So if you take 38 and you go ahead and you increase that by 10%, what you're going to get is 41.8, right? We've seen that several times throughout this video. So, okay, well, I see. If we're going ahead and we're getting 10% damage out of weak spot, and apparently this card also provides 10%, well, then that's an extra 20%, right? So if I go right on ahead here and I take 38 and I multiply that by 1.2 to signify that we have 20% more damage, that should be 46, right? No, it is not. It is 45.6. And that matters a lot. A lot when these numbers start getting big, like when you run explosive builds. You want to know what actually happened? Let me show you. So instead of it going 38 times 1.2 for that 20%, instead, since these are separate categories, all right, since these are separate categories, one of which is weak spot damage and the other one is bullet damage, again, these are categories, those multiplied with each other first, and then they got applied to your damage. Okay? Oh, I love this stuff. So let's go on over here and show you why that matters. So if I go right on ahead and then I take this 10%, so 1.1, and then I multiply it by itself, 1.1, what you get is that's actually a 21% increase. rather than just a 20% increase. Okay, so if you take 1.21, right? If you take 1.21 here, 1.21, and then you multiply it by that 38, now we have 46 damage. It rounds up by that, 200ths of a spot. Now we have 46 damage. That's the number that we actually saw. Why does this matter so much? Because if you start running builds and everything starts getting bigger towards the end of the game, you get purple weapons, you get all these fancy cards, you get big time upgrades. These things start becoming multiplicative, so these numbers get blown out of proportion. And now these categories are all over this game. And there's so many categories that I can think of. There is bullet damage, there is melee damage, there is just general damage, there is character damage. Walker's 10%, that's its own category that things become multiplicative with. We're not just adding all these percentages together, we're multiplying them off of each other, so these numbers explode and you get huge things that can happen, which is why why you see some of these builds that just absolutely obliterate things. It's because they're making use of this. Jim is another example. His character damage is its own thing. This is if you played Outriders, this is like the same exact thing they did in Outriders. I'm pretty sure they do this in Diablo as well, where different categories are multiplicative. However, the same category within itself is additive. So if I had an extra 5% from, I don't know, sniper damage, I would multiply that with bullet damage. But if I had an extra 5% from bullet damage, I would just add it to this bullet damage category. So you want to have separate categories in order to get the most out of your damage. Does that make sense? So maybe to help make this a little bit easier to understand as to why you'd want to pick different categories when you're doing extra damage. So if you take a peek here, we have weak spot, weak spot, weak spot, weak spot. So if, let's say I already have 80% weak spot damage, right? Well, if I go ahead with knowledge is power, all I'm going to do is turn that into 90% weak spot damage, right? But if I were to pick a different category instead, what I would do is I would maintain this 80, but then let's go ahead and go to the bullet damage one, because we know that bullet damage affects weak spot damage for some reason, but it's its own category. So silver bullets would be a much better pick simply on the categorical basis. Never mind the fact that it also affects gun damage. But since this is its own separate category that affects weak spot damage, you would want to pick this over just adding into the category that says literally the word weak spot on the card. Try to look at the cards as to what the categories are. And to really express why multiplicative matters so much, let me go ahead and show this to you. So if we have, again, let's take our example before. Let's say we have 80% weak spot damage currently because of these two cards, right? Well, we can either just add an extra 10% with knowledge is power, or, you know what? Let's go to the other bullet damage thing, since it's a different category. Let's do this one. Let's do 7.5% extra damage. You would think, okay, well, that's less than 10. So it should be less. But let's bust out the calculator and showcase how that is not how this is going to work. So if I have 80% damage, that's what 1.8 means. Well, if I just add another 10%, now I suddenly have 90% extra damage, right? But how it works when you have different categories is, let's say I have my 1.8, right? But then instead of just adding, let's go ahead and multiply by 7.5% damage. That's actually a lesser number, but we're multiplying it now. So what happens when we do that? So multiply that by 1.075, because that's how you do 7.5%. And instead what you'll get here is 93.5. You're getting 93.5% damage rather than just 90% damage, even though the card you picked is a lesser card. Isn't that interesting? So this card, large caliber rounds, purely from a weak spot perspective, does more weak spot than knowledge is power would if you already had a bunch of weak spot bonuses going on. Now, what I'm going to try to just rattle through here real quick for you is how some of these cards work, because it's probably a little confusing, because it is a little confusing, about why some affect weak spot and why some don't. Reason why that is because they said so. Really, that's really the only reason for it. They just said so. So let's remember here, glass cannon. That only is going to affect the gun damage. It doesn't affect weak spot damage. Well, what about the weapon-specific things? Like, let's say sniper. 10% sniper damage, that's cool. But not as cool as you thought, because it only affects the gun damage. It does not affect weak spot damage, okay? So weapon specific cards, glass cannon as well, these only affect the weapon damage. They don't affect weak spot. Now, what gets a little weird is melee. If you take melee cards, so plus 25% melee damage here, melee will also affect weak spot damage. So a really interesting thing here is if you take a look at glass cannon, it says plus 25% damage. Plus 25% damage, right? Well, if you take a look at spiky bits, what you'll see is it says plus 25% melee damage. You would assume these do the same thing, right? In terms of the amount of damage you put out, but they do not. And you know what? Let me show it to you. Let me put it right in your face so you can be like, huh? Just like I was. So I have glass cannon equipped here, right? So let's see what it does. So if I hit them in the tummy, I do 18.8, right? I hit 2 of them, so I get 2 numbers, 18.8. Well, let's hit him in the head. Well, instead what we had was we had 18.8, but then also the bonus of 16.5, right? Because we hit him in the weak spot. Now, this is where it really matters that some of these cards affect weak spots and others don't. Now, let me go ahead and go back and put on spiky bits, and you'll see that instead of 18.8 and 16.5, we get different numbers. Now we have spiky bits equipped, and again, it's still just plus 25% damage, except it has the melee classification on it. And for some reason, that means we get a different result. So if I hit him in the head, well, you'll see we have that 18.8, but we also have 20.6. That was 16.5 before. That is a huge percentage change. Imagine how blown out of proportion that gets. We're using a crappy little bat. There's that extra 25% that we, for some reason, were not getting when we had glass cannon equipped. Because for some reason, glass cannon doesn't affect weak spot bonus damage, but for some reason, melee damage does. But for some reason, bullet damage does. But for some reason, sniper damage doesn't. So these things matter. It's really just comes down to testing each card and being like, okay, this one does this, but this one doesn't do that. But then this one does this, but not that one. But definitely this one. It is literally just testing each card. In terms of things that I could assume are categories, just to kind of help you out. I bet you Confident Killer is a category. I bet you, and I know, bullet damage is a category. You know, specific gun classes are a category. I wouldn't be surprised if the aim down sights card, and again, I don't know all these yet because I have to test them all, but Patient Hunter, I wouldn't be surprised if Patient Hunter is a category where these things can multiply. Now, does Confident Killer affect weak spot damage? I don't know yet. Does Patient Hunter affect weak spot damage? I don't know yet. But it's worth going card by card by card by card to see which ones do and which ones don't, because they don't all do what you think they would. But think about this, like this fire axe, man. This fire axe, level 1, no upgrades, nothing, does 85 damage. Now, if you're suddenly not getting any extra weak spot damage off of that because of things like glass cannon or whatever is just a general damage increase, then holy crap, you're missing out on a bunch. By the way, character things. Walker does not add to bonus weak spot damage, and neither does Jim. They will add to your gun damage or your weapon damage, but they don't add to that bonus weak spot damage. Oh my god, I didn't even get to the complicated weird part yet. You ready for this? So let's start talking about mutations. Let me hit him in the weak spot here, and what you'll see is 62.7 and 41.8. Okay? So we're still getting that extra 41.8. But I hit him in the weak spot, and that was much higher than 38, wasn't it? Much higher than the 38s we were getting before. And if I would have hit that guy somewhere else, it still would have been 38. In fact, let me try to find another mutation here. And then let's take a look over here. What you'll see is if we don't hit him in the weak spot, we get 38. So it goes back to that 38. Here's a record. Goes back to that 38. So that indicates that if you hit him in the weak spot, there's something else going on other than just that bonus weak spot damage. It almost seems like something's amplified. So let's take a peek at how crazy this can get. So now I have hyperfocus on. Before we were just doing a vanilla run, nothing else, then knowledge is power, but now we're gonna do hyperfocus. And let's take a look at some mutations and see how these numbers change. So we got a tall boy here. Now let's try to hit him in that weak spot. Right there. And what you'll see is we have a 91.2. So we had, you know, let's review what just happened there. So we had that bonus damage that we get from hitting the weak spot. So it's usually 41.8, but since we had hyperfocus, That brought it up to around that 60 number that we saw earlier in the video. But something else that happened was that that 62.7 that we saw, that went up to something in the 90s. It was like 91 something, right? In fact, I already had done the math here on my calculator. It went up to 91.2. Now, what was really interesting is that it was affected by extra weak spot damage, indicating that not only is there a general just bonus thing that happens when you do weak spot damage, the actual damage you do your gun damage thingy can be affected. So really what that ended up becoming was it was a 38 that we hit for bonus. Apparently hitting a mutation in their weak spot will multiply that 38 by 1.5. And then you take that number and you multiply that by, both of these are weak spot categories, so they get added together. So we multiplied it again by 1.6. And that is how we go ahead and get 91.2. Here, go ahead and take a peek for yourself. 38 times 1.5, because that's apparently something that mutations get, is if you hit them in their weak spot, that 38 changes into something 50% higher. And then we went ahead and multiplied it by 1.6 because of the 2 weak spot cards we have. And that's how we get that 91.2 that you saw on the screen. Now, something to keep in mind is I think I have a mutation up here, right? Not all mutation weak spots are created equal. Ow. Sometimes you will get higher numbers. I've noticed on the Wretches, I believe, I get a much higher weak spot number on the regular gun damage part than I do with something like an Exploder, because there are different subclasses to each one of these mutations. So let me get on out of here and let me explain this. So with the tall boys, there's 3 different types of tall boys. There is the tall boy, there's the bruiser, and then there's the crusher. With the wretches here, or the wreckers, excuse me, there are wreckers, there are wretches, and then there are exploders. And then with the stingers, there are stingers, there are hawkers, and there are stalkers. Some of these dudes have a more fragile weak spot than others, and I think this gets even more exaggerated if you take a look at things like the breaker or the ogre. Their weak spots are very squishy, and not only that, if you break a weak spot on one of those bosses, you do a big chunk of damage just because you broke it. Also, something to note about armor here is that if you hit something in the armor, you, for one, are not going to do weak spot damage, but you also don't get your bonus damage either. It goes back to the base value of the gun. Let's try to hit him in the armor here, right there. And what you'll see is it negates all the extra bonus stuff we have going on, even with glass cannon. Glass cannon's completely negated when you hit armor. There's 2 more really interesting things I want you guys to consider before we get done with this video here. But before that, I want you guys to know that we stream every single night on twitch.tv/SwingPoynt. I'd love to see you guys there. We do viewer games, we do nightmare runs, we do all sorts of fun stuff. And also, if you've enjoyed this video or it's helped you at all, please consider subscribing. But with that, something I think y'all should know is about these shotguns. So if you go ahead and go, boo! Well, let me tell you, I'm sure a lot of you have done this and be like, oh, okay, it does a lot of those. But did you know that they're not all created equal? So if you take a peek here, what you'll notice, and again, a really easy way to look at the damage is to look down after you do it. Take a look here. What you'll notice is one of those numbers is larger, indicating that for some reason, a bullet in this combo does more damage than the others. Now, my theory on this is that if you take a look at this card in here in the solo decks, I think it's called the Buckshot Bruiser. When using shotguns, gain temporary health for each pellet that hits. And I'm sure a lot of you have been like, wow, this card doesn't work the way I thought it would. My guess is that this initial pellet does more damage than the rest, right? So you're probably one-shotting things, and you're beating them with the first pellet that comes out. So you're not getting 5-something damage when you hit them with Buckshot Bruiser, because you're hitting them with the first pellet and they're dying immediately. Also, another thing to think about before we close out. I just went on and on and on and on and on and on and on about damage and how damage is different and how there's categories and this and that, and pay attention to this and that for categories. Keep in mind, there are other things going on in this game that are not just doing damage. For example, I would not be surprised at all if healing efficiency on Doc here is a category. It would be Doc's healing efficiency. And then there would be card healing efficiency. Or there might be other things like item healing efficiency. And I wouldn't be surprised if these all become multiplicative with each other. Same thing with the team trauma resistance. I wouldn't be surprised if you have team trauma resistance from Doc and then you run your own trauma card, if you get a multiplicative effect. And I encourage you, go through all of these. You have, I believe, increased use speed with Carly here. You have damage resistance on Holly. I wouldn't be surprised if her damage resistance becomes multiplicative. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the stuff from Evangelo, like team move speed or his stamina regen, is multiplicative with some of the other cards in the game. Something to consider when you're building your decks is creating different categories where possible. I hope this was helpful and that you learned way too much about the game. We are going to be doing Nightmare Run stuff here on YouTube if you want to see how I go through each level and talk through what I'm thinking when we go through each one of these levels to help get you guys through them. And again, remember to check out the Twitch streams, go ahead and subscribe, and then I'll see you guys in the next video that we do around here.